Schofer was my advisor at Northwestern when I was a student, and I was his first PhD student. And he survived that nicely. A couple stories I have to tell. That he's been there forever. He asked me not to say how long forever. When I moved there in 1971, he was there, and we'd just gotten a new faculty member from Berkeley, who was highly quantitative, to the max, ridiculously quantitative. And had a whole lot of master's students who were, engineers, but they weren't like operations research people. And his classes were brutal. And so we decided one day to, as a spoof, develop what we called an analog model of pedestrian travel in downtown Chicago. And our analog model was ants. We ordered a bunch of ants from Uncle Ben's ant farm. And they came, we had this whole thing set up to sort of model pedestrian travel with ants, analog. And they froze on the way in, and our experiment failed. It was fun. It was team building. The other story I have is that when I first moved out here in 1983, a year or so later I became director of research for the Washington State DOT and director of the Washington State Transportation Center, TRAC, in a very unusual appointment, which made almost no sense to me, but Secretary Berenson was kind of a withered guy, to tell you the truth. He could care less about, why can't you do that, And so he wanted the DOT to really get into research, and so we put together sort of an annual meeting where he would come, and because he came, all of his top staff had to come. I mean, had to be there. We'd go to places, San Juan Island, etc. Well, the first one we had at the faculty club across the street. And I invited Joe to be the first speaker for this event. And I'm not sure he even knows this, but so we're down there at the cocktail hour, and it's going and going and going, and Professor Mahoney sort of says, oh, let me go check out dinner's coming. He goes upstairs and comes back down and goes, there's nothing going on upstairs. What? You have to order dinner? And so we rushed around, and Colleen, the director, put together a dinner from scratch that was really good. At the last moment, and we had this big event, he talked, no one knew. My bar bill was horrendous. Horrendous. But it all worked. So those are my stories. Joe's been a great friend ever since I was a student there. He had a problem with me with the analog stuff because that was the only time I really got into research. The first 2 years I was there, I had all these ant books. But, I think he got over that. So, Joe, we're really happy to have you here, and pleased that the weather changed, and we had a great dinner last night, so thanks.
Thank you. So do me a favor. There are people in the back row. Come to the front row. Thank you very much. Come on. This is leadership in action. There you go. It's very important. Because I get very lonely up here, and I don't want to be lonely. So let me say a couple words about Scott and about PhD students, which I think all the faculty know. And that is the motto that we use when we talk about our engineering school at Northwestern, is that we're only as good as the products we produce. And it's people like Scott who make our reputation and make my reputation. Over the years, I've certainly learned more from him than he learned from me. It's probably just the way you were learning at that point in time, but in any case, I learned a lot from you. I want to talk about making transportation analysis count. And let me see if I can actually make this work.
The arrow keys is what?
The arrow keys?
Yeah.
The arrow keys. Playing transition. Okay. Does that work? So I want to talk about advancing transportation decisions for different things, and those different things are listed there. And the thing that occurred to me when I was putting this together, and I spent an inordinately long time putting this together, even though this is something I've been thinking about for 3 or 4 years, answers the question I posed on the right, and that is, how the hell does this guy know anything about this? I spent my career in the university, and the answer probably is, no, he doesn't really know anything about it. But I've read a lot of literature, and one of the things piece of advice, and there was a few nuggets of advice I offered to students in this talk, is don't just read in your field. Get beyond that. Read other kinds of literature, because there's lots of things to learn. So I've read a lot, done a lot of observation, and I've had the opportunity, primarily through work that I've done over the last 10 years with the Transportation Research Board, to interact with leaders in the transportation field. And a few of them are shown in the pictures on the right. And I've tried to listen and learn and put that knowledge together. And I will tell you that, so I've been in the business for a very long time. I'm not anywhere done learning about this. There's always something new and useful to learn. And I'm trying to keep my ears open. Some of the people I've learned from are people in this room, people with public agencies, and I really appreciate your being here and the opportunity that you've given to me. So when I think about what moves transportation decisions, one thing that's really clear to me is that it's not only about data and analysis. Lots of other factors are really important. And what are those factors? Well, you get some idea if you look at this slide. My animations are running really very slowly, so it gives you time to think. Lots of factors influence transportation decision, and we're kind of over there on the left, collecting data, doing analysis, and producing information. So remember that chain of that supply chain: data, analysis, information. And sometimes I think we get the sense that, well, we're very influential. Lots of other things, lots of other people are influential, and some of those things and some of those people are informed and database, and some of them are emotional and totally disconnected from what we might consider to be elements of reality. And that's really the world that we work in. So we put a lot of emphasis on the left-hand side, but the rest of this is really important. So I think it's useful sometimes to understand our position in the world. And I've had really very enlightening conversations with people in this room since I've come here to UW yesterday. And I've had a lot of conversations with people over the years. And I think sometimes it's hard to get focused on that and realize what our role in the world is. And sometimes I think it's easy to get discouraged and say, well, look at this decision which doesn't make any sense, and I didn't recommend this, or I wouldn't have gone in that direction. And I think the challenge in life is to step back and say, well, there's something I can learn from this. What is it that I can learn? How was this decision really made? And how can I do a better job of being a part of that kind of decision in the future? And one of the things that I have learned, and I would want to leave with you, is for decision makers, choices are about outcomes. And outcomes that's not as obvious as it might seem. Choices are about what can transportation do for us. So I think, working 40-some years in the field of transportation, it's really it's easy to get focused on transportation is really interesting, and I understand that, and it should be obvious to people. But in the end, the question is, what can it really do for communities? How can it create jobs? And create, I put in print in quotation marks, because sometimes the creation process is complicated and messy, and sometimes it doesn't occur at all. How can it enhance competitiveness, which it might do without creating jobs? How can it expand opportunities for people? How can it improve the quality of life and make us feel safer? And if you're following the business of transportation, there's tremendous emphasis in the last 2 or 3 years on performance measurement. Lots of people spending time on it. It's mandated by the legislation that's in, surface transportation legislation that's in place right now, which is called MAP 21. But when I step back and I think about it, first of all, the mandate of MAP 21 is really not important. There's a really strong argument for doing performance measurement and performance management without having that law that drives us in a particular direction. And what I'm hearing from decision makers is the new performance measures are really much more focused on outcomes than they are on how the transportation system really works. So what do I mean by outcomes? So I've been teaching this, Scott probably remembers this model of the transportation system for about 40 years. I think I have about 40 more years to go teaching this before I convince people that this is probably a useful way of looking at transportation. So there's something called a transportation system, takes in some inputs, land, labor, and capital, and good stuff like that, produces outputs, which we talk about in terms of performance, or the condition of the system. So let me try to make this go a little faster. The performance characteristics are suggested there. But what's really important to decision makers is outcomes. And what are outcomes? Outcomes are the things I've already started to talk about. Competitiveness, jobs, income, sustainability, equity. They're the next step in the line. And outcomes are the result of some interaction with the environment. And what's the environment? The environment is all the things that I've listed there and many more. The state of the economy affects the outcomes. So you could put a transportation service out on the landscape, produce a particular quality of service. But what that does to competitiveness, to jobs, and so forth, is driven by factors that we don't control, driven by the economy, driven by the competitiveness of local industries, driven by the weather and climate. We don't control them, but they're particularly influential in what happens. And when we talk to decision makers, their focus is on what ultimately happens, what those outcomes are. So a little bit of a digression. So one of the characteristics for which I'm known in teaching is an awful lot of digression. But I've been thinking about job creation, because there are a lot of claims that are made about job creation. So I'm going to drift a little bit away from the microphone and say, these are newspaper stories that I've clipped just in the last week or so. I pick on Illinois because I'm from Illinois, and Illinois is a land of politics and prisons. Our governor made some great claims about the job creation associated with a bridge across the Mississippi River. That's a bridge at New Bridge at St. Louis, between Illinois and Missouri. And you can't read that, or I don't think you can read that, but he claims 3,400 jobs will be created. And one of the things that occurs to me is, well, the number of jobs that are created by a transportation project may not be the most important basis for selling transportation projects. Why is that? Because you could do a lot of other things and spend money in a lot of other ways and create jobs, or not create jobs. And what depends on the job creation? Well, tell me about what the project is, and tell me what the design is, and tell me what the mix is of materials and labor, which changes from project to project. There's a lot of uncertainty, and there's a lot of variability associated with that. I was particularly enamored by the story that's from one of the New York radio stations that's below that, about the Brooklyn Bridge rehabilitation. And this is hard to read, but I can read it. And what it shows is the claims for the number of jobs created. The estimate was 834 full-time equivalent positions. And what that really means, if you get up close to it, is 834 person years. So if you employed 834 people for a year, you're done, and they're not employed after that. So those are not enduring jobs. But that's what the claim is. The vice president, our vice president, Biden, said this project would create 150 jobs. So it's a little bit fewer. If you go down to the bottom, New York City's own data said it created less than one job. And when the Transportation Commissioner, who at that time was Jan Sadiq Khan, was interviewed, she said, well, we have 44 people on site right now. And that's great, except are there new jobs? And what fascinates me, and I think I will have time to get back to this, is that there's no auditing of this. Nobody goes back and said, well, Governor Quinn, our governor in Illinois, you promised 1,400 or 3,400 jobs. Where are they? Did they really occur? We don't follow up on that. And that's a flaw, and that's a problem, because that becomes a selling point, and the useful and important question is, did we deliver on that selling point? Did that happen? So let me give you another Chicago example. So if you've ever been to Chicago, and Scott, you will have to remember this. This is the Chicago Transit Authority junction between what's known as the Brown Line, which is that train coming in from the left. We're looking north here at Belmont Avenue, and the Red Line, which is the tracks that go straight off to the right.
That's my apartment.
Did you live the one that says crafts?
Yeah.
Okay. I couldn't get one that's in that sign on there, so I guess that sign really is there. The way this works is the brown line goes off to the northwest, goes off to the left, and the red line goes straight north and south. So when the brown line train comes up from the south and is going northwest, it crosses over all those tracks, okay, and that causes a delay. It causes a delay for the north-south lines, for all the trains running north-south. And that's been like that for probably 100 years. And the Chicago Transit Authority has a scheme. So this is a schematic on the left. You've got 4 tracks running north and south, the brown line, which is appropriately colored brown, going up to the left, and you can see the little train crossing over all the tracks. And the scheme is to build a flyover, which is really clever. It's only took them about 100 years to get to the point of saying, maybe we'll do this. And they claim they can get this flyover for $320 million. It's going to require taking 16 properties. And transportation projects are like that. You just have to do that sometimes, and maybe that's a really good use of resources. And what's the benefit that comes from that? Well, the benefit, if you look at the numbers that the Transit Authority claims, is in the form of delay reductions. So what they claimed in the original claim was it was going to save something like 4 minutes per trip. But when you look at the fine print, it serves an average of about 84 seconds a trip, some much longer, some much shorter. Yeah, that's not a lot, but this is a really busy junction. And I had a conversation with one of the leadership in the Transit Authority who was really angry because the newspaper, actually the architecture critic from our Chicago Tribune, jumped all over the Transit Authority for proposing this because it was going to take 16 properties, and he thought it was ugly. He's not an engineer, an engineer could look at it and say it's a really beautiful structure. In the conversation I had with people at the Transit Authority, what they said to me was, no, it's not the time savings that's really important. It's the fact that this will substantially increase the capacity of the rail line by eliminating that delay. Increase train throughput, increase accessibility, increase development, increase opportunity for people. So that's an outcome. It's not the performance of the system, it's the outcome that's really important. And the problem is it's really hard for the Transit Authority to say, well, for sure this is going to happen, because all those other factors depend on it. It depends on the land market, and it depends on whether that neighborhood that Scott used to live in is really trendy, and it turns out it is really trendy. So that's the real value. And the question is, well, so how do you tease out that value? And the answer is, it's really difficult, and it's substantially uncertain. But that's what drives the decision. So, and there are lots of ways to estimate economic development incomes, and I hope people are reasonably familiar with it. Because what you're talking about is changing connectivity in the network, changing capacity in the network, changing quality of service. We have some predictive models that throw some names down there. Some of you may or may not be familiar with those. There's some interesting tools around that are very focused on case studies, and one of the things that we find when we talk to decision makers is, well, so you can use the model to predict the economic development income, the jobs added. But decision makers find the models problematic, and why is that? Because they don't understand them. Well, I got that part, but they don't understand it. Because they're lots of times not right. I've seen that before. So they don't have confidence in okay. So Mark is kind of different than the models that you develop, because I know that people understand them, and we have very high confidence in them. But this is outcomes. This is a step away. So you're dependent on all those other factors coming together. So what we've heard in talking to decision makers is, tell us stories. Give us case studies. Show us what happened in other cases. And we can have a long discussion about why that in itself is a bad way to anticipate. But telling stories, it turns out, is very influential in pushing decisions one way or another. So one of the questions is, how do you get those stories? How do you put them together? And how do you deliver them to people? So a fundamental message, and a vague message, I have to say, that I want to convey to you and I convey to my own students is, it's really important to figure out how do you make the case for transportation investments to stakeholders. How do you answer the question, what's really in it for me? How do you particularize this kind of information? So I started digging around and looking at what people are calling the value proposition. So if you listen and talk to people, especially in the management area, everybody's talking about value propositions. So what really is that? So I have 2 definitions. There are many definitions, and I picked these 2 to focus on. And the first says a value proposition is based on an analysis of the benefits, costs, and thus the net value that an organization can deliver to its customers. So you've heard about that. That's called benefit cost analysis, or cost benefit analysis, or net worth analysis, value benefits less cost. And that's really an interesting definition that's very much based on a transaction. So you could think about, I will challenge you to think about going out and buying a car, and what's the value of transaction? So you put down money and you get back something back. So there's a very clear transaction. And while the decision may not be easy, you can think about a value proposition. At great risk, I offer you another transaction situation, and that's the choice of a life partner, where there's a transaction, there's an exchange, and it's an extended exchange. And what's fascinating is that people are able to do that because it is a transaction. And I think there's a broader definition of value proposition. It's harder to deal with, but I think particularly useful from my perspective of looking at transportation projects. And that says a value proposition is a promise of value to be delivered and a belief from the customer that the value would be experienced. So it's less transaction oriented, and it focuses on the notion of what's the credibility of the information product. How believable is information that we give to people, and what determines that? Well, you determine that if you are delivering the information. Are you a credible person? The State Department of Transportation or the Port Authority, or whatever agency is making that offer, or making that proposal, that credibility, I think, is on the line. And I have to say that credibility is quite variable. And I cannot speak for the context that you live in, but I can say that where I come from, in Illinois and in the Chicago area, there's a great deal of suspicion about projects coming from public agencies. And so one of the things to think about, and I don't have a solution to this one either, but one of the things to think about is how do you build that credibility? And the evidence, and there's some interesting evidence that's from outside the transportation area, is that a lot of the credibility comes from delivered results. You know, I try to do this, I implement a project, I tell you the project's going to be good, I deliver the project is good, and the last part of it, which sometimes is hard to do, and that is I need to stand up and say, see that, I deliver that project, it's good. But it's a lot of it's based on delivery, producing results. What are the dimensions of that value proposition? I think you have to think about how does the project, how does the policy connect with things that are important to stakeholders. So what that really means is you've got to understand about who the stakeholders are and what is important to them. And I think what you're dealing with is a situation where different value propositions are necessary for different people, because different people, different stakeholders care about different things. I think everybody looks at projects and proposals and thinks about how does this relate to my problem? What is your action that's going to resolve my problem? What is our cost, my cost, and your cost? And what's the value produced for me? I don't think it's very easy, and I think it's very distant from the notion of kind of predicting the performance of the system. You really need to go another step to figure that out. I think you also have to pay attention to what I've called transactions and disconnects. So if I think about building a facility, building a bridge across a body of water, and charging the users to go across that bridge. So a reasonable user can look at that experience or think forward about what that experience will be like and say, well, this is what I get back for it. I get back the opportunity to cross this body of water, to save some time as opposed to going around, or to avoid some congestion that might have occurred in the old setting. And if I'm told that, then that's kind of a transaction. You get this service, you pay for it. Now, it's not the case that people really understand that well. And maybe I'll give you an example. Well, I will give you an example of that. So you can look at a price facility and you're kind of confronted with the travel experience and the cost right there. But the fact is that if we drive motor vehicles, gasoline-powered motor vehicles, that we're paying a tax on the fuel, which is a user fee. But people don't know that for the most part. I mean, the surveys have repeatedly shown that if you go out to the population and say, do you know how we fund the transportation system, the highway system, people have no idea. So if you come in and say, well, I want to increase the motor fuel tax by 3 cents a gallon to maintain the highways, people don't understand that, because they don't understand that they've been paying that fee, a much larger fee all along, and you're asking for a small amount more. So there's, addressing that transaction is not particularly easy. It's much easier if you're talking about a specific facility and a specific experience. But there also are disconnects. There are disconnects between the negatives that come out of a system construction or system operation, for which we really don't compensate people. And we try, but we don't do a particularly good job. And the pictures show you some examples. So in the bottom picture, you see construction of a noise wall to protect a community from noise from a highway. We have a particularly egregious problem in the Chicago area because we have a really big airport that's not only a major source of delay for the nation, but it's also a major source of noise for the people living near it. And do we compensate? Well, we put money into soundproofing houses, but that, in the end, is not really compensation. So there isn't the transaction there. And you have to look at that and say, you have to expect people to be unhappy with that. And what the economists will say very logically is, well, we need to find a way to internalize the externalities. And as I understand it, what that means is, so if you fly in and out of my airport and make all that noise in the airplane because you're flying, that you ought to pay more, and that money ought to go back to compensate the people. And I think the problem is, you really can't compensate those people. Yeah, you can do things around the edges, but you don't solve the problem. And I think that makes projects really hard to move ahead. So what's the resolution? If there's a resolution, it may mean a relocation of the facility, or what you see in the Los Angeles area is relocation of people, getting them out of that high noise area and moving them somewhere else. Or redesign of the facility. Yeah, it's a little hard to do with airports, but it's not inconceivable. And if you look at the history of aviation, one of the turbine-powered aviation in particular, what you find is the noise level associated with jet aircraft has gone down very systematically because of changes in technology. Now, we've increased the number of flights, so we kind of make up for it, and it doesn't make the world all that much better, but there has been some technological innovation there and intervention as well. Mitigation. So you see pictures of mitigation at the bottom, but also mitigation in pictures at the top because we've put money into soundproofing houses. And in the end, you might think, well, maybe it's a project we shouldn't do because the cost is really high and makes people uncomfortable or unhappy or makes them sick. And I think what I'm trying to get at is this notion of reconstructing the value proposition, that is thinking about the people who benefit and helping them to understand this trade between investment and product, and addressing the people who pay the cost and don't particularly get the benefit in some way, not only through compensation, but by finding ways to be more sensitive to them and to modify technology and designs to do a better job. So here's another little digression. So I spend some time in my classes teaching about benefit cost analysis. And I feel guilty when I do that, because on the one hand, it seems like something that people really need to understand if they're going into the profession. On the other hand, my observation is the benefit cost analysis doesn't have a lot to do with investment decisions that are made in the public sector. And so what's the point of it? Well, I think benefit cost analysis is really important for us in the back room, if you will, analyzing projects, filtering projects, and making sure that projects that are particularly unattractive don't advance. I think when you get to the point of presenting projects to a public sector decision maker, high-level decision maker, addressing the build, no build task or question, I think benefit cost analysis is not particularly important. Why is that? Because it's aggregate. Because you're talking about big numbers, the aggregate benefits and the aggregate costs. And the fact is, nobody really experiences that. People experience very individualistic outcomes. And political decision makers in particular respond to constituents. And so they try to emulate and follow the needs of those constituents. So I don't think that's overwhelmingly important. I think there are a lot of projects that have, in a strict sense, unfavorable benefit cost ratios that have advanced because somebody wants them. I may have a little time at the end to address that. So I've said, covered this, what I wanted to say, this notion that this is a tool that speaks to the aggregate, and the specifics are what become really important when you're putting together this value proposition. And I think, and what I hear from decision makers is, what really works better is a narrative. So what's a narrative? Well, there's a simple word for narrative, and that's a story. Can you tell me a story about this? Can you tell me how this facility is going to make things better for our community? And can you maybe link that to the data, but take the data and use the data to drive a story so that I can understand it, so the average person can understand it, although probably nobody's average, so the decision maker can understand. Make it real for people. So that goes from the analytic to the narrative to the descriptive. And that's a translation process. So if in the end, and if you fall asleep now, I'll tell you that one of the conclusions I'm going to draw for, particularly for people entering the profession, is being able to tell really well-informed stories, to write well-informed stories, is a particularly important skill. So what does this mean? The new value proposition to me means talking about benefits in really specific terms and delivering them to really specific stakeholders. And doing that in multiple dimensions. So I'm going to give you the numbers, and I'm going to give you the stories, and I will show you examples. So I've talked to decision makers, talked to a decision maker in Kansas City a couple of years ago who said, I was looking at a traffic management problem in my community, and it seemed like a roundabout's really a good solution, the right thing to do. And the mayor of the town said, there's no way that I'm ever going to build anything like that in my community. And the way it was resolved, and I don't quite know what steps were followed to do this, was that the traffic analyst and the mayor did a field trip. So if you remember back when you were in grade school, field trips, they were like the best days. You really wanted to do a field trip. So you took the mayor to do a field trip. It took him somewhere in the East Coast to a place where there were a lot of traffic circles. And the result was, the mayor said, oh, that's what you're talking about. That's a good idea, let's do that. So what was really different was, it was a case study, it was an example. It won't always work, but in some cases it could make a lot of difference. I point out to you the SHARP 2 project, so I assume people know SHARP 2, Strategic Highway Research Program, Iteration 2, which was like a $250 million investment, federal investment that was pumped through the Transportation Research Board, and lots of different projects were done. So within SHARP 2, there were 4 tracks. I could name them, but I won't. But one of the tracks was the capacity track. That is, how do we get more capacity out of the transportation system that we have now, the surface transportation system? And one of the questions that came up was, how do we anticipate economic development impacts of transportation projects? And the first answer was, well, we've got the models that REMI produces or ERG produces, analytic tools. And the response was, we don't understand them. Give me examples. So we hired a contractor. I was on the steering committee for this, and we brought in a contractor to produce a product that's called TPIX, which I think it's explained down there because I thought I'd forget. Transportation Project Impact Case Studies. So what they did was they vacuumed up 100 case studies across the country of transportation investments where they could get data, before and after data, about economic development impacts. And so they told 100 stories based on that. And what they created was a case-based reasoning system. So if you know what a case-based reasoning system is it's here's a bunch of case studies. You tell me your case. I'll try to find a case study that's close to that and say, okay, well, I'm not telling you that this is what's going to happen, but here's an example of what happened, similar situation, similar kind of project. So it's another sort of cheaper than the field trip in the end. It's another way of showing the people the kinds of things that can happen. I think it's also really important to be realistic about outcome estimates. So remember I showed you that slide about job projections? And I think job projections associated with transportation projects are completely all over the map. And what really troubles me is that people never go back and say, did it happen? And I think one of the reasons for that is that a lot of times it really didn't happen. It didn't get that value out of it. So I think being realistic, circumspect, if you will, about outcome estimates is really important. Here's an example. And this is Proposition R in Los Angeles. Proposition R was a proposal to raise local sales taxes by a small amount for a period of time in return for delivering specific projects. And it was for a long list of projects, highway projects and transportation projects. So kind of in a representational form on the right, I have the transit projects on the top and the highway projects on the bottom. And in the proposition, this was the promise that was made. So when I talk about value proposition, this is, so I'm using proposition in two different ways. The value proposition is we're going to deliver these products if you allow us to collect this additional tax. And this, in California, it requires a 2/3 majority to pass a local option tax. And they got the 2/3 majority, and they're building the projects. And if you go to their website, one of the things you find is that they're very good about progress reporting. This is where we are, this is what we've done, here's what the schedule is, here are how things are performing. And that reminds me of this notion of, well, they made a promise, and they're now delivering on that promise, and they're promoting belief because they're showing we're going to do this, we did this, and you're producing this result. Now, it's interesting that they went back to the voters and asked to extend the period of time they were going to collect this tax and build more projects, and it failed. It didn't work. So the first time it worked, the second time it didn't. Well, that's not unreasonable, but they were able to make some progress, and there's a whole series of examples out there where going to the voters, really going to the stakeholders and saying, I want more money, but this is what I'm going to do with it, and being very specific where that has been successful. And I use the term, scares some of my colleagues in the transportation field, an auditable promise. A promise that you go back and say, you said you're going to do it, did you really do it? And you can say, yeah, I really did it. And that's what builds confidence and credibility in the agencies, and makes it easier, I think, going forward to do more of the same. And one of the things that occurs to me is, well, there's a risk. Some of us have spent a long time learning and developing tools for transportation system planning. And this is very project-oriented. It's not really, doesn't look like it's oriented towards system development. But it could very well be. That is, the projects can come out of system planning. So there doesn't really need to be a disconnect there. One can still work with thoughtful projects. Now here's where I'm taking a massive risk, and that's why that little caution sign is up there, because what it says to me is, don't be a complete fool. Don't come to somebody's hometown and tell them what they did or what to do. But there was a Proposition 1 in King County, and you guys know more about it than I do. I just read what I can vacuum up and steal on the internet. But what I found was this map on the right that indicates voting patterns. So that Proposition 1 failed. This was a proposition to increase the sales tax, and my understanding was a very small increase in the sales tax, to fund the transit system and to fund the improvements or rehabilitation of the highway system. Now, my caution is I don't really know any of the details of this. But the voting pattern is really interesting. So the red is the negative and the green is the positive votes, and the pink is negative, but it's not such an overwhelming negative vote. And if I get this map, and from what I know of your community, it's the same people in Central City that voted in favor of it. So they're the people, they're likely to be more heavily reliant on transit. That makes sense. They're likely to have lower levels of auto ownership. That doesn't surprise me. They're likely to experience a much higher level of transit service right now. And that's not a fault of the transit agency, because there's an interaction here. You put more service out where there's more demand for it. So more demand, more service, that kind of serves the central area. And in the distant suburbs, it's not unreasonable to expect that people are going to look at that and say, I don't really need this, so why should I pay the extra money? So they didn't see the value proposition. It was fascinating to me, I found this and talked about this in the graduate class that I teach. And one of the students came up after and said, oh, my political science teacher showed the same picture, because you can look at it from that point of view, a different perspective and a different set of tools. But similarly, the question is, how do stakeholders respond to proposals? Like the proposals to say, give me more money and I'm going to do good things. And you can tell me, and I shouldn't have no basis for being critical of the proponents of this, but I'm not sure the degree to which the promises were made about specific projects and particular improvements. And to the extent that that wasn't done, I think it makes it easier to understand a vote like this. If you took this same vote in Chicago, it's exactly the pattern that you would see. People in the suburbs would say, there's no way I want to do this. And people in the city would say, yes, we want to, we can increase the tax rate and we want that money to go into transit. The difference, I suspect, between the Seattle region and Chicago region is the Democratic Party in Chicago and the strength of the voting in the central city. So what would happen in Chicago is much more likely it would pass because the Democratic polls would get out there and kick the butts of the voters and get them to vote. So the turnout would be much bigger in the city. And that's been the pattern. That's we funded transit in exactly this way. Please don't hear this as being critical. It's being observational. It's something about transaction, about value proposition, about how people think, and then the question is, well, can you go back if you really want to pursue this and reconstruct the value proposition so you can make a stronger case that people in the red area are going to get some benefit. And maybe you can't, and maybe the answer is, well, we need to break off separate those communities and tax it at a different rate. It's fascinating to me to look at something like that and say, you know, I can open up a newspaper, you can open up your newspaper and say, and realize there's something to learn about transportation, about decision making, about how people respond that goes past us every day. And I think it's really important to learn from that. So in part this is based on a talk that I gave at the Transportation Research Board meetings in January. And one of the things they tasked me to do, which I was really disturbed about, was this. They said, well, I want you to talk about freight. And I don't really want to talk about freight. But one of the things that I learned as I thought about this is that when you talk about value proposition for a freight project, that's a lot harder because most people don't get it. Freight's really not important to me. Freight's only, I don't think about freight except when I order the pair of shoes from Zappos on my computer on the third floor of my house. I normally run right down to the porch waiting for them to come with the expectation that they should be there now, and if not, then they'll be there the next day. And I sort of get it that has to do with the performance of the freight system. But I don't think the average citizen gets that. And so freight has this problem of invisibility. And invisibility extends beyond the buying shoes from the Zappos example. Because freight mostly doesn't move in front of my house. Mostly it moves in boxes, and I don't know what's in the boxes, and so it's very distant for me. Making that the case for the value proposition, I think is much harder to do there because of this invisibility. And so talked to a colleague about an issue associated with subsidizing a container port, which wasn't making enough money to cover its costs. And it was kind of hard to build support for that subsidy. And if there's a way to do it, and I can't look at this and say, well, I know the key to solving this problem. If there's a way to do it, I think it involves saying, let's look at the role of that facility in terms of what it does to the local economy. What role does it play in the supply chain? What businesses are affected? How much employment is affected? What's the volume of shipment? What's the value of the shipment? And what options do people have? And to the extent you can talk in specific terms, it may be put you in a situation where you can restructure that value proposition and make a case for it. And it's a quantitative argument, you need data to support that, but it's also a qualitative and descriptive argument. That is, there's a narrative that has to go with that to carry that message to people who are going to make the choice. I had the opportunity to have a conversation with the Secretary of Transportation in a Midwestern state, and in a dominantly agricultural state. And one of the things he brought up was, what do you do with the need to address the poor condition of a road that has an average annual daily traffic of 5 vehicles? And the answer would be, in the quantitative sense, you don't do anything. It's 5 vehicles. Does it really matter? If you go back up here, what he said and what I learned from him was, well, what do those 5 vehicles do? What's the role? What's the function? And the answer was, well, there's a big farm there, and they raise soybeans. And soybeans are a huge product of Midwestern agriculture. Soybeans are a dominant export commodity. So they move from the Midwest down the Mississippi River to the Gulf onto bulk carriers, and they're shipped to the east and they're shipped to the west. So it's really important. It's important for the exchange rate. It's important for the economy of that particular state and for the sustainability of that particular farmer. And so when you start thinking about that, the value proposition changes, because you can say, this is really what it does. This is really why it is important. So I think about this notion of promise and belief. And I think, what does it take? I think it takes understanding of the issues and the context. So context is really important for going from outputs to outcomes. It takes situational awareness. And as I struggle as a teacher, I feel like one of the most difficult things to teach students is situational awareness. Being aware of what's going on, what's happening in the field. So we're working in transportation, we're working in planning, we're working in economic development. What's going on out there? What are the issues, and can we learn from those issues and bring them back in and meld those issues with our analytic tools to find better ways to address them, better ways to understand. What do the stakeholders really need? So it's not a bad thing, I wouldn't spend my life doing this, but it's not a bad thing to go to the parties with your friends who are not in the transportation business and listen to what they have to say, get some sense of their perspective on these issues and problems, and think about ways to meet them on their grounds rather than hoping that they'll meet us on our grounds. To find a way to say, what's in it for me? What's in it for you? Why doesn't an investment really make a difference? I talked about credibility, and I don't need to keep beating on that, but I think that's a really critical issue, and it's something to pay attention to, and it's something as students, and I think at some level all of us are students of the field, that we need to keep in mind. We keep learning and finding ways to boost our credibility, and making reasonable or realistic promises. Now, I know what the world is like, or at least I have a sense of what the world is like, and I know if I'm working in a public agency, I can't control what the elected or appointed leadership do, but maybe I can provide some information that would help them rein in the promises, and so that they are realistic and that they are reasonable. One of the state transportation secretaries that I talked to made that statement, which I think is really telling, and it's important for all of us that are in the educational process. And he said, some of my engineers still see the customer as the enemy. And I think that's a problem. And it's mostly an old line problem, but it links to this notion of situational awareness. Of what I tell my students is looking out the front window. What's really going on out there, and how can we work with these people? Collaboration seems to be the name of the game, and collaboration seems to, with the stakeholders and with the community, seems to give us a better product. So one of the other products that's coming out of Sharp 2, and I talked about this research program that's now coming to an end, is a planning process structure, if you will, a tool to organize the planning process that's out on the web now under the name PlanWorks. I don't particularly care for the name, but one of the principles of one of the things that PlanWorks does is it lays out this decision process that it takes to move a project ahead, and it deals with the regulatory processes, but it also deals with the notion that we've gotten ourselves into trouble in too many cases by planning a project and developing that, and then going out to the community after the project is well along, or going out to the regulatory agencies after it's well along, and finding out that people come and say, I don't like it, this is the problem. And what PlanWorks is figure out all those people who are going to say, yeah, I don't like it, and bring them in the front door at the beginning and work with them. And the challenge is, you'll get a different product. And that may not be exactly what you're looking for, but you may get a product that you can implement. It reminds me of a principle that comes from one of the management faculty members in Northwestern, where I come from, Phil Kotler, who's really, people would say, is the father of modern marketing, who's taught us that marketing today is not advertising. Marketing is developing products that people want to buy and will buy. So it feeds back, it goes back to the product development process, and I think that principle applies to planning and product development in transportation as well. So I need to say a few words about delivering information to stakeholders and to decision makers. And there are lots of forms of this information, and I've gone over some of this already. we certainly don't want to go away from objective measures, from predictions, from analytic tools, because that's our base. And the question is, how can we kind of interpret that and move that into other languages that may be more accessible to people who are making choices? And narratives is one of those approaches. The other piece of information that comes into play is public opinion. And I found this quote from Abraham Lincoln, surprisingly enough. Public opinion in this country is everything. Public opinion really makes a difference to decision makers. And that's why if you think about and go back and look at that diagram I had on the second slide where I had that decision maker in the middle and lots of different sources of information affecting her. Public opinion was one of those. And how does public opinion develop? It comes from experience. It comes from what they read in the media or see in the electronic media. It comes from values, and it comes from opinions valid and not valid. So it's a very confusing sometimes source of information. It's something you can't ignore. And I think one of the things that we as technical professionals have to pay attention to is the notion that getting a balanced view of public opinion is sometimes really hard. And that the internet is like the source. I think students today probably rightly see the internet as the source of all knowledge. The internet is also the source of all garbage. And so it makes it really easy to move junky information around. And it's very hard for people to sort out, unless they have some expertise, what's real and not real. So when we talk about public opinion, what really we hope we're looking at is some kind of a reasonable sample of what different people think. And a lot of times you're fighting an uphill battle because you don't have that reasonable sample, and it's extraordinarily cheap for people to put information out that isn't accurate, that isn't valid, and it's very expensive to refute that. So that creates an interesting and challenging problem for them. I talked about examples and case studies, and I don't need to keep saying that, but I think those are really important. Another thing I think is really important that we ignore is learning from experience. And we can call it post-project evaluation or before and after evaluation or project auditing, but there's such a great opportunity to learn from what already happened. What was the result? In fact, if you want to evaluate projects, one of the things you really need to do is answer the question, what did we actually do? Because sometimes there's a plan and you go implement the plan, but what got implemented isn't the plan. And some of us old timers may remember the term as-built plans. And what I remember from my old days in engineering was that you sent somebody out to measure what was actually built in contrast to what was proposed to be built, because they were not the same. So what was this intervention? What was the project actually like? And what really happened? What was the outcome? And what worries me is that, at least in the territory that I work in, the people that do post-project evaluation are typically the investigative reporters. And I don't want to leave that to them. I want to do those kinds of evaluations to make the models better, so I can predict better, and to show people what I've done and to learn how to do better design. To make this connection between delivery, here's what I did, demonstration, I'm going to tell you about it and show you about it, and to build credibility and to build belief. And one of the things I've observed over the years is that the most useful kind of post-project evaluation that you can do is to bank your own case studies. That is, in your own community, if you're doing traffic operations studies or you're building new facilities or providing new services, collect the data there and analyze it there so you don't get caught in this trap where you say, well, here's a case study from Colorado, and this is what happened, and somebody says, yeah, but we're not like Colorado. I'd like to own that data myself, to own it in my own jurisdiction. Making a commitment to that, I think, is really important. It's not free. And in fact, it's an opportunity for graduate study and research. It's an opportunity for students to do some of these case studies. There's some wonderful examples around. But you look at the three really big and really interesting hurricanes that have hit the United States in the last 7 or 8 years. Katrina, Sandy, Irene, which sort of wasn't the hurricane that hit New York, and Sandy. There's really good examples there of learning from experience. So we did a case study of tropical storm Irene hitting New York. We talked to the people in the Transit Authority, and I can go into a lot of detail about that, but that's not important. What's important is they said, you know, we learned from Katrina. And we got a call from the governor's office after Katrina, and the governor's office sent a message and said, don't let this happen to New York. And so they developed an operating manual based on what they saw in Katrina. And the operating manual, and based on some other things as well. And in the operating manual, there's a line that says, when sustained winds forecasted get above 40 miles an hour, start shutting down the system. And they did that. And what's fascinating to me was that's the biggest, busiest transit system in the United States, and they had the nerve to shut the system down. But they learned. And they did it twice. They did it for Irene, and they did it for Sandy. And they were really good about building credibility, building belief by telling people what they did, why they did it, giving people a lot of warning. And I think if you look at them, we've done this, if you look at the response in the press and the response in the Twitter world to that, it was a very positive response. People understood that. And so there are lots of opportunities to learn like that. From that, there's some federal programs that have and are doing that. And if you look at what's going on in the EU, there's a strong tradition of post-project evaluation from which they learn. Delivery modes. So there are lots of different delivery modes. We've talked about that. I don't want to go into that anymore. But I think that especially for students, and especially for people moving into the profession, there's some essentials of communication that you really should remember and take with you. And one is timeliness. And what decision makers have told us repeatedly is decisions move at their own pace. I've got to make a decision in a certain time frame. And if your data aren't ready, I'm still making my decision. So there's this terrible risk of letting the perfect drive out the good. What does that mean? It means I can't give you the data right now because they're not perfect. So I'm going to take another week. In the meantime, the decision has been made. And one of the things that suggests is, well, it's a really good idea to have the data in hand before you move forward. Brevity is also an important factor. And this example is one of my favorite examples. These are 4 pictures out of a collection of, I believe, 12 pictures that Pablo Picasso drew in 1945. And what's fascinating about this is that the sequence on this slide, from top to bottom, is the sequence in which Picasso drew the pictures. So the last picture is the one that he was looking for and that he was satisfied with. And you could tell it's a picture of a bull. He was quite satisfied that he conveyed the message of the picture of the bull by that very sparse diagram. It took him a long time to get that. But getting to that, I think, is really important because that's the kind of message that sinks in. Every decision maker we've talked to says, give it to me in a half a page. Give it to me in a page. Beyond that, I don't have time for it. I have to move on. And the message needs to be clear, and customers need to understand it. So, what's the road to success, if there is a road to success, or maybe the trolley line or the high-speed rail line to success? When we talk to CEOs in the transportation business, they say what you as students need, and what you as faculty need to teach is communication skills, very important. Situational awareness, that is not being isolated and not treating the customer as the enemy. The ability to collaborate, to work with the community and to work with your peers. And creativity, to come up with really good solutions in situations where problems are really difficult to solve. So that calls for what? For engineering. I don't want to forget engineering because engineering is really the fundamental skill. But it calls for data analysis, for writing and speaking skills. It calls for the ability to do visualization. Today it calls for the ability to communicate through social media. In the end, what I'm talking about is meeting the customer on our own grounds and solving problems that way. So that's all I want. I actually have 35 more slides, so I'm just like any other PhD student. I'm glad to share them with you. But I'm going to stop, and if you have a question or two, I'll be glad to try to answer it. So you have to have a question.
Joe?
Yes.
I've heard earlier talks you've given about the importance of rational economics and the
I've thrown all that out.
and the ability to allocate costs among the beneficiaries. But yet, particularly the Los Angeles example illustrates the political science Christmas tree ballot measure, where you add enough projects to get a majority and spread the costs as thinly as possible.
Well, what's interesting about the Los Angeles case, there are many things that are interesting. first of all, this is not the first time that California communities have done this.
Right.
It's happened before, and I think it's worked out reasonably well. And I think that, as I tried to say, it's not a matter of pulling projects out of the air. It's a matter of starting with a systematic plan and saying, okay, what are the pieces that we would like to put down on the table to build this puzzle, to complete this puzzle? And then instead of saying, oh, well, here's the grand plan, and this is what the system, the network diagram looks like, let's go out and talk to people about a list of projects. Now, it doesn't mean the list of projects doesn't add up to the grand plan, but in effect, if you want to sell that, you really need to go to people and say, you're going to get something out of this. And if you go to people and say, they're going to get something out of this, and we want you to pay for it, I think it's much harder to sell that. It's not impossible, but it's a lot harder. So part of this is parsing out the project into components that are salient to people. So an individual can look at this and say, in this, there is a value proposition for me. I think a big part of the challenge is to make sure that you maintain that holistic perspective, that you think about system planning when you do that. Or if you're thinking about a specific facility and only specific facility, then I think you need to talk about what that facility is going to do for various stakeholders and how you're going to connect the cost of that to those stakeholders. So Mark and I had a conversation before, so I'm actually learning a lot more from this visit than you could possibly learn. But you talked about, in the 520 bridge, about and I won't get it all right, but you talked about the diversions and the fact that, well, if you do this or if you don't do this, affects traffic in a lot of other places. So a variety of communities in the region have an interest in the outcome there. And I think what you need to do is to be able to talk in rather specific terms about, so what does this mean for you? How does this affect you? And there are going to be constituents out there for whom it means nothing. And some of them may support you and many of them won't. I think that's the name of the game. It's not, people are not particularly altruistic. People, except for planners, tend to be altruistic. And if you want to get stuff through, I think it's very hard. That's not the way to go. Okay, another question? Yes?
How do we teach students to tell stories?
Oh, I love that question, and I wish you would give me the answer to that question. I think you get them to tell stories. It's like the same, it's how do you get them to solve calculus problems? Well, you show them some, but you get them to solve a lot of problems in order to do it. So I think it's really hard in the context that we're in, but I want my students to be able to write those stories. I want them to be able to stand up and tell those stories, and I want to be able to say, okay, well, where's the data? How does that relate to the data? How do you do that translation? Communication is really important. It's been an issue in kind of a negative sense for engineers for 100 years. I know you don't care about this, but I have to tell you that there was an engineer named John Stevens, and you remember him well, Mark. John Stevens was the second chief engineer of the construction of the Panama Canal. In that, he's famous for that. But what you don't know is he was famous for, he wrote a lot of stuff about what it takes to be a successful engineer. And he wrote that after he did this job as the second chief engineer of the Panama Canal. And so it's dated like 1914. You read that, and it's like, it's salient right now. And a lot of what he says is, you need to be able to talk to people. You need to be widely read. You need to understand what's going on in the world to make that communication. So practice, yeah, and you have to show them. I once had a conversation with a cardiologist. It was a cocktail party conversation. And I said, so tell me about your work. And he looked at me and he said, it's very complicated, you wouldn't understand it. Well, we can't do that. We have to say, let me tell you about my work, and let me tell you how this relates to you. So I think it's not easy, but I think it's very doable. And we have to ask our students different things. Yeah, another question? Yes?
So Joe, we had another speaker last week or 2 weeks ago talking about the bias in transportation analysis.
Yes.
Because normally when we have a plan try to do something, we tend to make the analysis in our side. So
I can't imagine that. You mean people aren't exactly even-handed?
No.
He actually had a real interesting comment. He said, because of the distribution, projects that you select are at the top end of the distribution, even when you try to be fair. But the fact that they are at the top end of the distribution means you've increased the probability that you've overestimated those benefits. So that
So you favor the projects that are favored projects, yes. So this may relate to the work on overestimation of demand and underestimation of costs in projects, that there's an optimistic bias. And you can relate that to Daniel Kahneman's book, which I certainly recommend to everybody, Thinking Fast and Slow. We talked about the bias of optimism. And part of it is backing off and learning to be even-handed. And it's not particularly easy when you work in an agency, and the agency and the work of the agency may be driven by a decision maker who has a vision. This is the solution, so I want you to make this solution work. And that's really, I mean, that's another lecture, but one of my favorite examples of that is have you ever heard of the interstate highway system?
No.
Anybody heard about that? What's it called? It's got a name.
defense.
No, the current popular political name.
National Highway System.
No, come on. It's named after a president. It's called the Eisenhower Interstate System, right? Okay. And so and Eisenhower was the visionary. And what did he do?
Went on a field trip.
You need to justify.
Oh, tell me about that. Yes, he went on a field trip. It's very important. What was the field trip?
He saw Audubon.
Oh, that wasn't the real field trip. That was the second field trip. He saw the Audubon because he was commander of Allied forces in the Second World War. What was the first field trip he went on? Do you know? Who knows? You gotta know history. Very important.
Was it when they tried moving the convoy across the country?
Absolutely. And do you know when that was?
It was the 30s, right? Or the
No,
it was celebrating World War I.
World War I.
That's I'm committed. That's why we were all engineers, because you don't know dates. But you remember your significant other's birthday. It was 1919. Okay. He was in a convoy that went across the country in motor vehicles to see what it would take. And it took them, I think I'll get the, I have a slide, but I think took them 70 days. And it was, they didn't want it to take 70 days, it took them 70 days. And so people say, well, that was the vision that he had. But you have to remember this, because I made you read this. There was a report that came from the Bureau of Public Roads. Oh, by the way, when was the interstate highway, when was the vote taken? When did that program start? 56, right. So you're good. Very good. Started in 56. Eisenhower was president then. He advocated, he pushed it. But there's a report that's called Toll Roads and Free Roads. It came out of the Bureau of Public Roads, and it was dated 1939. And that was the feasibility study for the interstate highway system. If you look at that, it's got a map in it, and you hold that map up like this, and you hold up the map of the interstate highway system, and you say, by God, they had it then. If you look at the tools that they used, they were foundational for all the analytic tools that we use now. They did data collection. They did surveys. They did public. Did you ever hear of an organization called the Gallup organization? G-A-L-L-U-P. It's a polling organization. In 1938, that was one of Gallup's early jobs, was to survey people, and he was surveying them, asking the question, it was a state of preference survey, asking if they're willing to pay for the use of roads. And the outcome was no, and so they didn't go in that direction. So it's fascinating you talk about, well, I try to talk about visionary decision making. It annoys me that people talk about the Eisenhower interstate system and what a great job he did. Yeah, and you look back in history, and who did a great job? Was the engineers that did a really great job, because they did all that planning. And when it came to 1956, you go back to that document that was done in 1938 or published in 1939. And say, here it is. Here's the roadmap. This is what to do. So when I see a decision maker that's kind of pushing a great idea, a lot of times that great idea was around for a while. People thought about it a lot, and if it wasn't around for a while, the door is open for us to come in and say, okay, I've got analytic tools. I'm going to take a great idea. I'm going to make it work. I'm going to find a way to do that. So yeah, I mean, there's bias. You have to deal with bias unless you are the king. And I absolutely recommend that, but it's not particularly easy to get in that position. And then the challenge is to kind of work inside the organization and and make it work. Yes?
Following, or for drilling deeper into that, are there different communication strategies you should use when you think this person with this amazing vision might have the wrong idea? Like, how do you speak truth to power when you think something's not?
That's really a dirty question. I think you should have asked that question. It's hard, and there's a career risk in that. You can get into a situation like that where you can lose a job. And if you're careful, so I think it takes a lot of care. And a key to that, I would say, is building a relationship with the decision maker, having that relationship. So when you start out, some of these, an entry-level employee in an organization, they're not going to have that. But as you work through, that's part of, to me, is part of situational awareness, of knowing who's in charge and building that relationship with somebody in charge, because that's really the key to communication. And you need to have a quiet setting, a situation where you can interact with somebody and talk about what are the consequences of making that kind of an error, buying a project that isn't a good project, and is there a way, or can I can help you find a way to make that not so good project a good project. So I've told this story to a couple of people since I've come here, but a long-term colleague of mine was sitting with the then mayor of the city of Los Angeles, who asked him, well, what do you think of this transportation policy? Is that a good idea? And my colleague said, well, it's an interesting idea, but if you do this over time, this perverse outcome will result, and that's not a good thing. And the response was, well, I won't be in office then, so I don't really care. And you have to deal with that. I mean, sometimes that happens. But building a relationship and having the ability to say in a quiet way, I mean, not going to the press, for sure, but saying in a quiet way, this is a problem. And here's the evidence. I can show you. So I've got data, I've got analysis, I've got tools. I can show you what the value that, here's why that's wrong, or here's how if we take your idea and change it to something a little bit different, it can be better. I've certainly, in management situations that I've been, I've said something like, I don't use these words, but you've got a great idea now. If we just change it the following way, which is basically throwing it out, then we can do something real good. But one of the things to keep in mind is that decision makers who are going to be around for a while, one of the most important drivers for them is avoiding screwing up. So if you can say, you're going to get into trouble doing this, that may be a way to do it. But you take a risk of getting fired.
The King County map that you
Yeah.
showed looks exactly like the regional transit measure map vote from 1994, where the city of Seattle voted for a regional rail system and the rest of the region didn't. And it looks exactly the same. And in hindsight, I think it was sort of obvious that the King County vote was going to go the way it did, because they were asking lots of people to vote on something that,
I mean,
my boss is next to me. So
I trust your hindsight better than mine. I mean, I can't make a pronouncement on that, but that's certainly a possibility. Charlie, what can you think?
You're free to say our ideas or one. So, the King County map's pretty interesting because Billy brought it up. I thought you had talked about it because take a look at it. It's got a lot of complexities to it. The east side pays 35% of the taxes. The sales tax at Sports Metro gets about 17% of the hours of service. So
when you say, I'm naive about the area, east side, is that east of the lake?
Northeast King County, yeah. So
Okay.
all the red area that was on that
Yeah.
map. And so the value proposition is pretty clear for them, which was and their elected officials were out there telling them, we're not getting value for this. There's a small sales tax as part of that, but the bigger tax was a $60, visible tax was a $60 vehicle license fee. People hate that.
Well, and it hit the people that were auto-oriented.
But it also is incredibly regressive. So for a poor, a low-income person who owns a car, having to pay $60 was a big increase in their vehicle registration. It's like a doubling of their vehicle registration costs. And so if you saw South King County voted overwhelmingly against it, South King County is it's where the biggest concentration of low-income people in the county is. And so they didn't see a value proposition because the taxes that were going to be levied, sales and a vehicle license fee, were regressive. And so, so you had I said it died of 1,000 cuts. because you had so many different interests that were somehow alienated by it, that it was really difficult to all pull together. You know, this is the first transit measure that's really failed in the recent memory in the region, and it's interesting.
I'd say it's part of my education is listening to you talk about this, and I think, well, so maybe if we came back in, we could reconstruct that value proposition and find some way to bring some satisfaction to people.
And they were trying to get a better source of taxes from the legislature, but they felt like they were rebuffed, so they went with what they had, and those were just flawed sources.
So as I understand it, they tried to solve it on their own because they couldn't get the legislature to support. Yeah, okay, so to me there are lessons learned. And you can say, well, maybe I can find a way to first of all, I understand about this vehicle licensing thing, and the notion of this regressive. I think it's really important to realize that there are a lot of low-income people who own cars and are very dependent on cars, and so that hits them very hard. So maybe there's another way to do it, or a way to talk about changing the service characteristics.
Well, also one of the things was that the legislatures were looking at, Central Puget Sound, quote, solving their problem, and then not getting those votes for a state package that the rest of the state needs, and so they weren't supporting that. That's why it didn't come to, didn't come for a vote, because they wouldn't support it.
Yeah.
Why would we give away all those votes? Because we'll need those votes.
Yeah, so
It's complicated.
So it's complicated. There are multiple parts to it. I think there's another piece to this, and that is, I think it's very hard. It goes back to the Los Angeles, the Measure R case. It's very hard to go to the people and say, I want you to pay more money for the transportation system, if you're not doing anything new. But if you're just saying, I need it to sustain. And no question you need it to sustain. It's just, it becomes really hard to sell that. And to me, that goes back to the notion, well, people really don't understand how we were paying for it before. So the asking for more money, it falls on deaf ears. It's a problem. It's certainly not unique to Seattle, but the fact that somebody was gracious enough to publish that map in the paper gave me